Welcome to the video, Universal Design Considerations. Now, let me be very clear. I am nowhere near an expert, and so all I intend to do is share with you what I do when I am designing and also maybe in the room facilitating around trying to increase the accessibility for learning and engagement. I highly recommend that you consult with folks in your organization that have depth of competence. And that might be folks in accessibility services, HR, training and development. You might also find some competence in local resources, some nonprofits that are really focused on supporting accessibility and universal design. You'll probably want to find local and regional resources to be able to have folks and interpreters come in, or consult with you in general how to do better professional development training that's accessible. So with that, just want to remind you the needs assessment. We really talked a lot about how do you find out the accessibility needs for learning materials and activities. And so you talk to your leaders, you talk to your contact. You may want to, again, send out an email to all the participants asking them what would be useful. And you never necessarily know, and people may not want to share. And so being proactive is critical. Now, when I know, then I'll ask the person that's brought me in, can you introduce me? But I'm also scanning the room. And then I'll bet 10, 15% of the time, folks come to workshops that no one has told me about. And so if I'm not paying attention, I might be like, ooh, I have to shift that activity. I always try to go meet folks. That's why I like to get 30, 45 minutes in the room beforehand. So I'm all set up. So as people come in, I can have one-on-one, relatively, if not completely confidential conversations with folks about how you're doing. So glad you're here. And if you're open, I'd like to talk through some of the activities that I was thinking about to see if there might be some ways that we want to just work together to make them work for your learning, other people's learning. Now, the first time, actually the first 5 to 10 times I did this, I still felt like I was walking on eggshells in my dominance and privilege as someone who doesn't have a disability. And I was tripping over words, and yet I believe folks mostly, and most said, really appreciate you thinking these ways and also having the conversation. Who knows? But these are what I do, and I'm open to feedback. And if you've got more competence, I'd love to have you share on one of our group calls. Because we're trying to collaboratively explore ways to shift anything I'm doing to increase learning and participation for the person we're talking to as well as others. And let me just make yourself very clear. What I've noticed is every time I shift something, it's not about, quote, meeting their needs, because the shift usually helps many more people in the room, whether they have a disability, whether English is a second language or not, their English fluency is at maybe a 10th or 12th grade level. They're just good learning ways for many people. So I want you to keep that in mind, especially if you find yourself like I have historically why do I have to do this? And, it's like, wait a minute, this is just good teaching, learning ways to do. So I'm just going to highlight some of the things that and it's all been from feedback and taught from others. So folks identify as visually impaired, that might be completely without vision, might be legally blind. Again, work with accessibility services in the organization. And if they don't call it that, every HR or training development operation, to my knowledge, should have capacity to take any PowerPoint handout and make it accessible for accessibility devices. That's as much as I know. So I don't know what the devices is called. I'm sure there are many different, probably 20 scores, different kinds of devices. But if not capacity internally, then they should be contracted with regional or national resources who can then make all of the materials they use on their website as well as in trainings accessible. And so you want to be then doing that, because I found that when I did PowerPoints and also handouts, even though I put them in PDF, I then learned that PDF isn't accessible. There's so many things I don't know. So work with people who are competent and get the materials accessible with devices. Because you may never know, when folks come in the room, I always want to recommend that you have the handout in an 18 font. I've been told by folks in accessibility services and many different organizations that is kind of the standard for folks that are visually legally blind, I think. Again, don't take my terms. Talk to other people because, again, I'm on the edge of not knowing what I'm talking about here. I've also been told that for our slides, using PowerPoint, everything needs to be in at least 32 font. A colleague of mine just sent me a bunch of their slides, and I couldn't read them on my computer. And that's with trifocals. There's no way that many people could have read them. So I'm going to give them that feedback. You want to make sure there's minimal text. And of course, whenever there's a graphic, you're explaining the graphic. And so again, you're meeting one-on-one and you're saying, here's the things I've done. What else could be useful? In general, everyone benefits, but particularly folks that are visually impaired, reading aloud all text on the slides, describing the graphics. And I've started having mics if there's 40 or more, or I ask the client, and it's in writing in the contract, or if they believe having handheld mics would be useful for people in the room. And again, that's for many different folks. It might be around English fluency. It could be if they're more auditory learners and not visual, and it's hard to hear across the room if someone's mumbling. So I think having mics is useful. Yes, it's a slower pace to move the mics around, but I get Fitbit steps, and the people usually laugh when I say that. And I also find that for folks who are reflective learners, my pace is way too fast. And so by using mics, it helps folks of many marginalized identities. It's another example, have one shift using mics, helps people in many groups. So folks with visually impaired, I think it's important to have an even pace and repeat if people speak quickly or may have jumbled some words. That'll give everyone in the room a chance to hear it a second time, which is always useful pretty much. But folks that are visually impaired or lip readers, it may be difficult to catch what one person says. And in moving activities, I've had people who use a cane. I ask, do you have someone here who you might move around with? And often they'll come in with someone. They're like, yep, I've already asked. They've already taken care of themselves. So I talk with them too, just to build a relationship. And so I've watched one person put out their arm and person who's visually impaired take their arm and move through. Now I ask the whole group to push in chairs, make sure the floor is clear. So that, again, helps everybody, but particularly if someone who's visually impaired, with or without someone who they're holding their arm with. Now, occasionally, I have offered to be the person to move them, be with them as they move around. And it could be if the person, their partner is in the bathroom, or their person wants to do differently. So all kinds of options. You also want to give the option to stay seated. This is useful for many different kinds of folks, different groups. But to say this activity can be one you move around. It actually works well if, 50%, 80% of the people move, and you can stay seated. Or if you want to stand up, but stay there and let people come to you. So the playing card activity, the gallery activity, when we're trading what we've written, let me stay on that. If you use gallery, of course, you're saying, if you don't feel like reading, then don't read. I do talk to folks with visually impaired about the gallery activity, and every person said, oh, it sounds like a great activity. I just won't read aloud. Or they've said, I will speak the ones that I'm thinking about, because I may not write either. What some folks have done with the accessible device have actually typed out a story, had someone else read it in, or they have just verbally given their own story. But those are options that the person, I may offer those, and or choose to do gallery where people trade, and then in a large group, I just ask people to volunteer and read 20 in the group, in the large group, or 50. You can adapt and change. My intent is to not have folks with disabilities feel spotlighted. Every single person I've ever talked to has so graciously said, I don't want to cause any differences. I don't want to have anything special. You do what you're going to do and I'll adapt. And I have said, everyone I've ever talked to has said that. And what I'm wondering about is how much actually we need facilitation trainers to have better universal design principles. Because my guess is you're adapting every moment of every day. And then I pause and folks just kind of like either say yes or energetically, there's a So that's why I ask if we can collaboratively, what else might be useful. All right. Again, if you have more competence on our group calls, let's share it for everybody. For folks who identify as hearing impaired, most likely they'll have let folks know that if they use an interpreter, most large groups that I'm in, there are interpreters. And if it's a keynote, I ask if I remember that they have one, even if no one has said, I want one. But then someone said, well, what language? I'm like, what? Because you probably know this. There's American Sign, there's Canadian Sign. Then as I was writing this, I'm like, there's got to be Spanish Sign Language or just sign in Spanish. So again, working with HR, what they've used in the past, what's been needed. I have sent the PowerPoint and handouts ahead and asked my client to get it to the interpreter services. I also have a copy of both, generally when I know there's an interpreter, but I was just somewhere this week and I didn't know, I'm like, and I hadn't thought ahead. So I'm not following all the things I'm suggesting. I need to. What I do is I meet with the interpreter and they usually ask, this is what they said, what's the topic on, any terms? I've offered to share them handout. I've offered to put it on a thumb drive. This time they said, no, we'll just follow. And I said, could you introduce me to the participant? And actually by then the client had already let me know, and I came over, said hello, and then I went and talked to them with the interpreter. Just to try to say hello and here's some activities coming up, and please let me know if I can be more, anything you need me to shift so I can be a better facilitator. So clearly, well, before I leave, I would check in with the participant, the facilitator, the interpreter, at breaks, and maybe even when there's small groups, just to kind of walk by, see how it's going. What I noticed is I needed to increase time for dyads in small groups, because you can imagine now, if you haven't ever done this, the interpreter is relaying what other people in the dyad are saying, and then the person who's using sign shares with the interpreter, and then the interpreter speaks. And some of that's somewhat simultaneous, but not completely. And so for the whole group, I'm just watching the groups where interpreters are there, just to make sure there's enough time, and I'll kind of check in and say, has this been enough time? I think it's important to caption videos. That's the second bullet. And you can, again, in the organization, they should have the resources to either do it internally or send them out. I have not used videos sometimes because they weren't captioned, and gotten the information out other ways. So have multiple ways to teach similar content and start working on captioning. I would encourage you to notice your pacing. And that's when I check in with the interpreter and the participant. I have a very fast pace. Interpreters tell me they're fine. They keep up. I don't know if they're asking their participant partner if that's about pacing. And so I had to wonder about that. Now I want to talk a bit about reading lips. Just recently, I was working with folks. Someone was reading lips, and I intuitively, or my guides gave me some ideas which that group had not ever thought of. And so I've not researched working with folks who read lips, but I just want to share what seemed useful. And let's keep talking on our calls. So I knew enough and asked, of course. I met them and they said, if you could just be in front of me so that I can see you. And what I noticed is I'm doing interactive activities, like we might have done dyads, and then everybody's moving around. So what I did is not only did I repeat all points, but I started pointing to the next person who was talking. So not just saying, okay, Susie, what do you want to say? I said, Susie. And I slowed it down a bit. And that way the person who reads my lips, but I extroverted this. I said, I just realized this. And I said to the person, would this be useful? And they nodded, they said yes. So then I said, can we all do that? If you're talking and you want to bring someone else in, point to them. And then I'll bet in that day workshop, 8 times I reminded people that when they're talking in the large group, now there were like 15 people, to turn and face the person who reads lips. And then the only other idea I had was not only to check in with the participant, but then to ask for either the client that brought you in or someone else in the group to also be watching you as the facilitator to coach you. Because I think in that day there were 1 or 2 times that I forgot. And so if I had had somebody that quickly say, oh, Kathy, we need to, then it would have met the needs of the group and particularly the person who reads lips. This group particularly started to noticing that how we were engaging to create greater universal design and inclusion were ways they wanted to keep moving and replicating. So, folks who read lips. And not everybody who reads lips is going to need the same thing. Similarly with folks who use interpreters. So that's why checking in will be critical. Take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt, do some research. I started to do research on Google and I couldn't find much. I'm sure there is, but get smarter and sharper, as I commit to as well. Now, folks are going to have learning disabilities, dyslexia, other ways of knowing, and you'll probably never know. I doubt they'll tell you that on a forum, but they may. And so I consistently am just watching as I've given reflections on worksheets or writing activities. I'm wandering around, just checking how many folks are all the way done, how many folks are halfway, and if folks are done, I'll just let them alone, or I might put up a different slide and say, if you're done, think about the 3 you want to share. I think working breaks are really helpful, so that if you're going to be taking a break anyway, give a reflection writing activity so that people have the time they need to complete it for whatever reason. And then if you do worksheets, reflection questions, have time to discuss so that folks that may learn differently, whether because of the learning difference, reading difference, writing difference, or just cognitively, they learn better by verbally hearing people or being present with someone as opposed to self-reflection. So all these strategies help introverts, extroverts, and folks with different learning differences. Now, if you're charting, I always ask for volunteers. I never say, could you chart? That may unintendedly put someone in the place that they're like, I don't want to chart. I'm noticing more and more as I'm typing or charting that I misspell words. And Apple Correct does not catch all my misspellings. Now, some of that could be I'm moving too quickly, not paying attention. And I've always wondered in my last couple decades if I've had, I switch numbers. So I've always wondered what that's about. So I share that in the group occasionally, especially if I notice on a chart or on a slide, which I've done many times. You'll probably notice in these videos, there are still words that are not spelled correctly. Okay. Always ask for volunteers for reading aloud. I just talked about the gallery activity where people don't have to read aloud. They can just pass theirs to somebody else. Charts, so if they're small groups and we're reporting in, ask for a volunteer, and you can always pass. And always use multiple learning methods. It's great, anybody, anytime, but particularly I wonder, people learning disabilities, to have both audio, visual, and experiential, always learning that same piece of content might be useful. And again, there are so many different learning disabilities. And so find some people that know much more than I do to see what else might be useful, and then come teach us all. Folks with mobility dynamics, to be honest, most folks have the most experience creating more universal design classrooms, workshops. And again, you may never know. I checked folk out. I was watching how they were doing the dyads in a 3-hour workshop. And at the end, someone around my age came up and said, I just want you to know that all that standing in the card activity almost did me in. And I was just felt horrible and thanked them. And so I want to keep sharing my mistakes so you learn from them. And this was just this month. And so I just was not paying attention. So again, if you notice someone is using a cane or a chair, a walker, someone has a foot, like I would sprain ankles all the time, and so they might have a different cast on their foot, cast on their arms. If I notice people's hands and arms, give me an indication that some of my activities may either be uncomfortable or awkward to do. So let's go up and chat. And or I'll go up and chat, especially if they're using some type of chair or cane to get around, and discuss plans, and then always be prepared to shift. Even if you talk and then you get in the moment and you watch the first several activities, you're like, you know what? Playing card activity, I have to figure out a different way to do it, and be creative. Always minimize time standing. So for instance, concentric circles. I generally always invite people to bring a chair over, and I'll carry a couple over so that they're there. Invite other people to carry them over so that people who might want to use them may not want to carry one over. If I'm going to be concentric for more than about, well, concentric is usually at least 10 minutes. So I just may set up a seated concentric. So everybody brings a chair, or you can sit on the floor, and I'll tell, I say, I can't do that anymore, but you're welcome to. Again, keep the floor area open, and again, always give people a chance not to move during icebreakers or any kind of other go find a new partner if. And just wave your hand if you're looking for a partner. And then I challenge everyone, pay attention to who's moving and create a group around them. So in general, really be thoughtful about when you're choosing icebreakers. If you've seen my work, especially live, I do one called Kathy Says, which is like Simon Says, except you never lose. You just keep playing. Kathy Says, put your hands up, put your hands out, put them on the knee. It's a great icebreaker, has many metaphors to use. People laugh. I love it. And if someone has arms shorter than mine, or may not have their arm maybe done at the elbow, or they're using a chair, and I notice that they don't use their arms except to move their chair forward and back, but they're not writing. So those are some of the ways that I'm like, that I don't do. Now, what I might do is invite 10 people up front to come play Kathy Says, and I'll kind of show some of the movement, kind of like I did with Let Me In, and trust that people make their own choices. I might do the same thing with the Aikido that you may have seen me do, where I have people, someone comes up and they have their hands put up in front of them, kind of like a push off. I ask if I can touch their hands, and I push their hands, and they usually resist. And then I have them push it again, and then I move so that we end up dancing, kind of little swing dancing. That probably didn't make any sense if you haven't seen it, but it comes out of Aikido. It's a great metaphor of moving the energy. So when I'm doing a train the trainer, or we're doing a navigate difficult situations, it's a wonderful way to get in people's body, not to debate, argue, shut down, put people in their place, some of those less productive intentions, but to dance with people and move with their energy, using pairs. I'm noticing, tell me more. So teaching those skills. This reminds me of a story, so that's here. So it's a great way to get the concept in people's bodies, and I don't always do it for a number of reasons, dealing with universal design. And so I might just have one person come up and demonstrate it. All right, deep breath, just a little bit more. For folks that are English language learners, some people talk about level of English proficiency, whatever language your organization uses, but you may want to double check to make sure it's relatively current. English language users, English language learners was the most recent I heard from folk whose work in an organization was supporting folks who are second and third, fourth language, maybe English, because they already know 4 other languages from around the world, and here. So explore, and based on the needs assessment, can we translate these handouts into the primary language of participants to have those available beforehand or online in the room? And then I have worked with translators. I think I told that story in one of the earlier videos. I've done it a couple ways. One was aloud to the whole group. And so I would say something, then they would translate it. Another is a translator working with a couple different groups. I think one was Chinese, I think it was in Mandarin, and one was Laotian, which I believe was a language, but that may not be the name of the language. And so they would be with that small group and repeat and work with the small group to help them in the activities. And the third way, just happened this fall, was simultaneous with equipment, which I had experienced when I was at a UN meeting, but I had not ever facilitated. And so there was a person who was bilingual, who was towards the back, and took what I or my co-facilitator said, spoke it then, and it was Spanish they were translating into. And then folks that wanted simultaneous in Spanish then had some type of earphone set that the translator brought. Now, this was a community event, but they were brought in by a certain organization, so they knew about how many folks would want this, and they also brought extras. Something new I hadn't experienced. It worked fabulously. But in general, when you know that they're English language learners, I always think it's important to minimize jargon, slang, less accessible terms, acronyms in general, and always, if I use them, explain what they are. But I'd love feedback on all my materials. I'd love you all to look at all my handouts and tell me what's jargon, because I'd like to try to get them even more accessible. So looking at your handouts, your PowerPoint, comments during session to make sure for everyone explain, but particularly English language learners, I would think be very helpful to have things explained in ways and, language they can understand, and they can be translated relatively easily. All of these ideas work for English language learners, I believe, as well as participants whose English proficiency. Now, they may be English language speakers, but their reading and writing English may be 7, 8, 9 grade level, if that. So all the other activities could be useful around jargon, handouts, acronyms, and for both English language learners and folks with English proficiency that may not be at the level of your handouts and slides, to really look back at them. And can you minimize reading, writing? Can you shift your slides so that you make sure, get someone that maybe teaches 8th grade to look at your material and say, would this be accessible for most 8th graders or all 8th graders? And again, all instructions written out on slide and handouts, and you read them all. Deep breath. What I was just thinking is, I need to know more, but that's a lot more than I've ever learned, and let's keep teaching each other. A couple final things. I'm noticing that perfumes, aftershave, I actually get headaches and actually a little woozy. And so in your email beforehand, you may want to list ones we talked about, say any other, ask about food needs. And so my guess is that any HR training development would have a good pre-email. We can develop one on a call if you want one. But ask for people to not wear perfume, aftershave, and then they might just wear a little bit. And then if people let you know it's too much, then you can have a chemical-free zone in an area, or a chemical zone that people are wearing perfume. You're on the side of the room. Speaking of which, chemical-free markers, I like the, vis-a-vis ones, Mr. Sketch. Again, I get headaches if I'm using, quote, the whiteboard ones or anything like that. And so if I'm getting the fumes and people in the room are. Speaking of colors, folks may be colorblind. You may never know. And so I just realized I don't know what colors are useful. I assume the lighter colors, so yellows, oranges, pinks, I never use. I might use them to put a little asterisk or underline something, but I realize that even that may not be very visible. So using the darker colors, so I use a lot of purples, blues, black, brown, red, maybe to highlight. Someone did tell me that my bright blue, which you can see right now, is if you're colorblind. And I forgot that, so I'm going to check out to be sure. When you're doing charts, as what we've talked a bit about, slides, big blocks, so charting, block printing, and nice big, minimal text, lots of space in between. And if you need to use more charts, lots of people cannot read like from maybe even 30 feet away. If they're only like an inch tall, so like 2 inches would be great. 3 is probably even better. So with that, take a deep breath. Hope it was helpful to review some of the ways that I'm currently trying to make my workshops, materials more accessible to a fuller range of people. And also that I'm sharing that I am on a learning curve and look forward to learning with you so that together we get smarter and better and create workshops that really meet the needs of the full breadth of students and don't invisibilize, particularly people with disabilities, English language learners, and folks with English proficiency that is maybe high school, middle school. I look forward to meeting you on the next video. Take good care.